Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the PivotBoss pre-market video for Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018. I'm Frank Ochoa, aka PivotBoss. Here's a look at the daily time frame of the ES. We are seeing another major sell-off here in overnight and pre-market trading. We were prepared. Yesterday during the pre-market report, what we were looking at was the previous session's midpoint. We were watching right there in the ES, in the NQ. We were watching that level in the YM. I mentioned that if there's any failure to get above the 80 to 83 zone in the ES, that could be pretty significant. If price cannot get above that previous midpoint, we could be looking at much more selling pressure ahead and a likely retest of the lows. That was just yesterday morning at this time, and you can see already what has transpired since then. A big push right into those lows. Took out those lows by a couple of points, 2 points or so, and is now showing a little bit of strength off these lows. Now again, we knew that that could be the case, and what I mentioned before is if we do come down into this zone, I would also again be watching for signs of rejection to go right back up as this thing perhaps starts to go back and forth. While we could see a major meltdown through these areas, that would come upon a major violation of 2700 and an inability to get back above that level. So price can get below that area and find rejection back up of these lows in the 2700. That would bode very well for coming back up toward the recent highs. Again, if price were able to reject those lows. Any failure to hold 2700, remember, opens up the next area down, and that takes you into those 2600s, 80s. So that's the zone right there. If this area can't hold, that would be pretty significant in terms of the next downside support if we can't hold this area. This area, if you recall, has held since May. Up until that point, we had this kind of compression pattern that had formed, and then we've gone up since then. So we've just now come back to that area. So we're right in the middle of the framework that we've been working off of all year long. And now we have to see, does price reject these lows? Does it get down there and get 2700 or 2703.75? And then what do we do after that? Because I believe that we could still see a rejection right back up as this thing starts to, whipsaw back and forth. All right, let's take a look at the NQ. Here's the NQ. Now in the previous session here, we were watching that midpoint there, but we also talked about 7200 being the real level, up to 7200. And if there's any rejection at 7200, that could offer an opportunity to sell this thing. And so again, that was the case, and you can see how that opened up selling pressure not only off the highs immediately, but throughout the day it was defended, and then we can see just the fall off here. We have not tested the lows here. It doesn't have to test those lows. We could see a higher low and then a push back up. So right now a bit of divergence here between the NQ and the ES, but there is still the possibility to test those lows at some point. But if we get a higher rejection off 7,000, there could still be an opportunity to bounce it back up. So watching to see how it responds down here. If we take a look at the YM, for example, just to give it all three phases here, you can see this one is just below, or had just pushed below those recent lows, 893s, today getting 845s and showing a little bit of bounce off that area. But this is the zone. If it was to bounce, remember, that's the level. We've been talking about that level the entire time. Even on this drop off, we talked about that level being hit. That's the 24,886s, and again, there it is right there, testing that zone. So if this area holds, again, we can get below it and hold a little bit lower. If it holds overall and we see rejection, I'd be looking for this thing to bounce right back up toward recent highs. Failure to hold this level would open up another 1,000-point decline into 24K. Right now we're basically trading 25K. So that's kind of the framework that I'll be working off of in the YM. Now taking a look at crude oil, this one remains weak. We talked about 770 in the pre-market report yesterday. I mentioned the last 3 times we've called for selling pressure, we've gotten it. This time I mentioned I'd be looking for rejections of 70 for a shot at dropping into 66 to 67, somewhere in that zone. And so far we're seeing that weakness. We didn't quite get into 70, and instead we're seeing weakness already to the downside. S3 on the PivotBoss bands is sloping downward, and we're outside of it on a 1 minute time frame. So again, that suggests more weakness, at least in the near term, unless it proves otherwise. So right now, until this thing can find a support, it's still heading a little bit lower to the lower edge of that channel. If we take a look lastly here at gold, gold is up 1.3% right now, breaking through the top of the tightly compressed pattern. We noted that pattern yesterday, how narrow it was and how that suggested a breakout. I mentioned if it were to break down and then reject that downside move, that could lead to a big slingshot move higher. But either way, the focus was to the upside unless this thing failed to hold 1220s, and so far it's done everything it needed to do so far to continue to remain bullish. And now for the first time we are testing and trading above the 1240 level, and that's the first time since July. Ever since we broke down below it on this day here, we have never even retested the level until this moment. And so again, showing a lot of strength here overall. It's had a couple of big days up. For the most part, it's holding those gains though. And as I mentioned before, if we can continue to hold 1220, there's a shot to retrade back toward composite VPOC, which is 1287.60. Alright, that is it for now. We'll see how this plays out heading into the rest of the session. Good luck and trade well.